Welcome in, everybody. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you got time tonight, we're gonna go even deeper down the rabbit hole. I want to say this first. I will be posting some of the videos on YouTube, but not all of them, because some of the stuff that I'll be talking about as we get deeper into this is going to be like stuff that YouTube is not going to allow on there. So, if you want to get this exclusive information, then consider joining the community. I'm not talking to you guys that's here live tonight. You're already here, but I'm talking for like when I post this on YouTube. So you can click the links in the description to do that. Other than that, we're going to gauge the room tonight. Remember what I said last week. We can all agree that we've been lied to about everything pretty much. And it's just been a generation of lies being told. We can't fully blame our ancestors, but they do have some partial blame for not ever, wanting to look past the lies. But regardless of that, we're looking at that now. So before we get into it, I just need to have your verbal consent that you're ready to get into this information. Pick back up where we left off and dive even deeper down that rabbit hole. So if you're ready to hear the presentation tonight and to spend your attention with me, unmute yourself and say, I'm ready.
I'm ready. Let's go.
I am ready.
I'm ready.
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 All right, let's get into it. So let's pick back up where we left off. True American history timeline. How we went from sovereignty to betrayal to reclassification to resistance. So pre-1492, the land of the copper-colored tribes. The Americas were already populated with complex indigenous civilizations, many with dark-skinned, woolly hair, and Moorish ancestry. These people were not Africans, they were autochthonous Americans. That means that we were already here, tied to the land through ancient matrilineal systems and bloodlines. So unlike the patrilineal system where they say you are what your father is, that's actually scientifically incorrect because fathers do not pass down mitochondria. Only mothers can do that. So you will carry your mother's genes mostly when it comes to how your genetics are dispersed based off of you carrying her mitochondria. So most people are fighting or trying to get through their mother's generational curses and not their father's. All right. So tribes like the Lenape, Yamasee, Saponi, Nanticoke, Powhatan, and Tuscarora populated in the eastern coast, especially Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. These people were classified by Europeans as Moors, heathens, or infidels, and not Negroes. Moor was a status, not a nationality. Okay? So from 1492 to the 1600s, this was the arrival of commercial trickery. With the arrival of Europeans, peace treaties were established with tribal nations, often broken in less than a decade. Excuse me. So, every country that Europeans ended up pillaging and conquering, they would first trick the native people there by getting into these peace treaties, where they would pretty much say that they would keep the peace and in exchange for the native people to let them like stay around them and study how they live and stuff like that. Land was never discovered because it was negotiated then stolen. So peace treaties like those between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English were used as traps. They granted temporary peace in exchange for trade, but were never honored. So the term mulatto began being used in the colonial documents to describe the children of dark-skinned indigenous people and Europeans, and often to blur tribal status and disqualify land inheritance. So if you were classified, because remember, we're the only group of people who have been reclassified 6 times. No one else has been reclassified other than the initial classification that was put on them when they put us under this caste system. But if you were mixed with the indigenous and European, you were called a mulatto. And if you had a long line of mulattoes, basically that word ended up turning from mulatto to black to African American. So each time you were reclassified, your DNA memory was erased. So 1600s through the 1700s, forced reclassification begins. And it was the 1705 Virginia Slave Codes that declared that all non-white people were either slaves or potential slaves. This included free, dark-skinned indigenous people like this beautiful woman on this picture, and who were now labeled Negro or mulatto. So she would be named Negro or mulatto, whichever she looked closest to. Okay. Free people of color, also known as FPOC, began appearing in census records often. These were descendants of the original tribes, stripped of national status and rebranded. So treaties with Moors were signed in multiple colonies, not with Africans, but with Moors already on the land. An example of that is the Treaty of Peace and Friendship from 1787 with Morocco, which was here, which was falsely used to tie Black Americans to Africa, despite Moors already being in America. And when you get to the bottom of it all, the dark-skinned original Europeans were also Moors, which are now classified as Africans. And they have always been jealous of our empire because our empire was more royal and more vast and had much more going on here. Because of their so Africans have tribalistic nature, which makes them fight each other. And look at, you got Igbos, you have no, y'all can't record. This is going to be on YouTube. So you have Igbos against Yoruba, and you have different tribes that don't like each other. And I've talked to some myself who would say that the other group was bad and scammers and all of this kind of stuff. But in my opinion, every person that I dealt with that was from Africa was all on the same type of time. But that's another story for a different day. Um, but those African Moors, they're called African today, but the European, original dark-skinned European Moors were very jealous of our empire here in America. So let's just say they sold us out. So 1789 to 1866, U.S. becomes a corporate empire. Look at these pictures here. This picture here is actually it's original, with the black or dark skin, brown skin, whatever you want to call them, so-called black people at the top. And this one is a rewrite of the people here. The Constitution, 1789, ignored indigenous sovereignty entirely, despite earlier treaties. Then you had 1830, where the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson was not just about Cherokees. This policy targeted eastern seaboard tribes like the Powhatan, Lenape, Nanticoke, and Saponi, etc., and forced them to either assimilate or to be removed. And they are my ancestors. Many who stayed were reclassified as free coloreds or mulattoes in Virginia, Delaware, Maryland. Mine were, some of them, when I look at the census records, say free colored, some of them say mulatto. Melungian, I've been saying Mulligan. I say the word wrong all the time, but Melungian is the proper way to say it. But those populations grew in the Appalachia and the Tidewater region. These were dark-skinned tribal Americans, some with European ancestry, but not African slaves. All right. From 1870 to 1900s is the identity erasure locked in. All right. So from 1871 is when the U.S. ends treaty making with tribes. So now they only see us as wards of the state. So in 1871, all of the treaties that they were making with us before, when we had more power, that was done, because now we had already lost enough power to be wards of the state. In the 1900 census, that's when they started categorizing people as either white, black, or Indian, but only if they were recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So around that time, they were already saying if you were dark skinned, you were automatically not classified Indian. Even if you were of Indian descent, they had already put into play their system to turn us into colored or Negro or mulatto. Thousands of true Americans, were told they were a Negro, colored, or mulatto unless enrolled in a federal roll, which they purposely kept a lot of us off of the federal rolls. And this is how the $5 Indians were able to get in and pay that $5 in a lottery to get on the Dawes rolls, so they can take on somebody else's identity and land and everything they left behind during the Trail of Tears. That's how they have a lot of our artifacts. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, that's when the one drop rule came out, and it made it illegal to claim Native ancestry if you had any Negro blood. This was done intentionally to eliminate claims to land and treaty rights. So the land they stole from us, a lot of our people were still holding on to our native ancestry, being as though we were the first here. We've always been here, and we connected to the land. But we were forced into this one drop bullcrap that came out saying that if you looked more darker, basically, because they only went off of your physical looks, if you look more like the targeted group that we're calling Negro, then you're Negro. One drop makes you a Negro. Doesn't matter if you are a Melungian or whatever, mulatto, none of that matters. Dr. Walter Plecker was the first Virginia registrar. Okay, so in this birth certificate system, you guys who are doing the status correction process, you're already familiar with this, but you guys already know that you have to go to the county registrar to order your birth certificate. So this racist weirdo European Dr. Walter Plecker was Virginia's first registrar, meaning he was in control of all of the records at one point in time, where he was able to manipulate the records, hide stuff, alter stuff and things like that. But he erased thousands of tribal records, which forced entire indigenous bloodlines to be legally reclassified as black, because every record that was in the books that said that we were who we are, they were erased. 1930s through 1960s. This is paper genocide and civil rights distraction era. Okay, so people from tribal America lineages like Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, North Carolina, and South Carolina were put on colored or Negro rolls despite family oral history or tribal roots. Melungian families were hidden in rural census records and purposely excluded from Native rights movements. Civil rights narratives intentionally centered African slavery, which erased indigenous American enslavement and sovereignty. And then they introduced terms like African American in the late 20th century, which was part of the final spiritual identity wipe. And the crazy thing is Jesse Jackson, one of the civil rights activists, who told you guys to call yourselves African American, well, guess what? He's still able to call himself what he is. He's a Cherokee American Indian, and he's able to still claim his heritage in exchange for selling us out to the African American lie. Y'all can look that up. So, who are today's Black Americans in the East Coast? We're going to go over the entire map. So, if you're wondering, like, where my family could come from and all that kind of stuff, well, this will give you an idea. So, who are they really? Powhatan Confederacy are those who, if you ever did genealogy or even a BS DNA test, even if the test tells you you're from Africa, you can disregard that. But however, if you do it on Ancestry, it's going to point you back to the land where your people originated from. And that's really all you're looking for. You're not looking for them to tell you the African lies of, pop culture. That's just a distraction. They always mix the truth with a lie, because remember, I was telling you guys about universal laws and how you got to gain someone's consent by mixing truth with lies. You can't tell like the full lie without giving a little bit of truth, because that's how you can get somebody's consent. But anyway, when they told you were African on that side of the DNA test, you ignored that, because on the back end side, they're telling you where your people originated from in America. So for my people and a lot of people I know, including my husband, who are over there in that area, like the DMV, that's Delaware. I mean, that's DC, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, Philly, some parts of New York, South Carolina, North Carolina, places like that, Georgia, South Carolina, stuff like that. Our people kind of like came from the same place in so many words. So the Powhatan Confederacy is who your family is, if or was associated with, if your origin started in Virginia. Then you have the Nanticoke and Lenape, which is Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. You have the Catawba, Saponi, Mahiran, and Tuscarora, which is in North Carolina, South Carolina, and parts of Virginia. And then you have the Yamasee and Gale, which is in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida region. And then many from the 5 civilized tribes were forcibly assimilated or reclassified. So free dark-skinned tribal families who are reclassified as Negroes, mulattoes, or colored stripped them of their nationhood. So every time that they renamed you, they took something from you, eventually all the way down to your rights. So what happened was that colonists began reclassifying tribal people with darker skin as free persons of color, which stripped them of their treaty rights and inheritance. The Indian Removal Act forced many eastern tribes off their land. Those who stayed were rebranded as Negroes and pushed into poverty. Tribal surnames were replaced with slave names or biblical names. Family oral histories were erased by public school indoctrination because they put us in boarding schools. And in those boarding schools, they told us that, hey, you're Negro. And if we say, no, I'm not Negro, I'm from the I'm Yamasee, blah, 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 blah. They like, no, you're Negro. And that's when they would whip you in front of class. So we'll get into the whipping thing and those whipping pictures and stuff. We'll get into that later on, deeper into this. But the lies they told go very long. So just walk with me through this and we'll get to everything. I promise you that. But then you had the Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, led by Dr. Walter Plecker, which made it illegal to identify as Indian if you had one drop of so-called black blood. He destroyed tribal records and forced everyone not legally white into the Negro category. And these indigenous families became known as the black community that we know today. But we are the same people who once held the land, water, and sacred knowledge of the East Coast. Okay, so that is where, if those states that I named, your family most likely originated from before all the movement and stuff. Let's get into those words I was talking about: mulatto, Melungeon, and colored. Let's talk about that. On these pictures here, you have some of people from Appalachia up in West Virginia. And I think the Appalachia runs from West Virginia through Virginia all the way up into like Tennessee or something like that. But look at their features. They have dark skin. They have like wavy-ish hair. It's not all the way straight, and they have like a mix of original American Indian and some European features. Fun fact: Abraham Lincoln was Melungeon, and so was Elvis Presley. So many were reclassified under mulatto, colored Negro as a legal trick to disconnect them from land and treaty rights. Also, Babe Ruth was also Melungeon. The term Melungeon used to describe people of Moorish, Indigenous, European mix, and not African. Most lived in Appalachia, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and parts of North Carolina. They're labeled as mystery people to cover up what they really were. They were the unbroken bloodline of the land, because even though they tried to breed the European into them, the one drop that they trying to tell you about, that one drop makes you a god once you have that one drop of so-called black blood. So if you have physical melanin like production in your skin, so like if you're more darker, you can get tan and not burn in the sun, then that is a way to tell that you have some type of one drop, like they said, of black, so-called black blood. This is also how some people were able to do something back then called white passing, where they would act like they're white just so that they can live the life that they want to, because they were able to fit in based off the terms that they created just for their benefit at the end of the day. So, who are today's Black Americans in the West Coast? Let's talk about California, Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. So, who they really are. They're the Washita Moors, also known as Moors, the Shoshone, Chumash, Tongva, Yuki, and Ohlone people. They're descendants of pre-Spanish indigenous Californians with dark skin, woolly hair, and advanced navigation and healing knowledge. They're also Moorish maritime families who came to the Pacific long before Spain discovered, in air quotes, anything. Many from pre-Columbian Columbian voyages and ancient trade routes. Okay, so what happened? Spanish missions and Catholic re-education enslaved and erased tribal identities. Their lands were stolen through ranchos and redistributed to settlers during the time where they were trying to, they were doing like a mass migration. This is after the Buffalo Soldiers helped them to kill off the regular people, and we'll get into that as well. I meant the original people. Original people reclassified as Negro, Mulatto, or Mexican, depending on appearance. Okay, remember it is depending on appearance. So some Mexicans are a part of the tribes through the blood. Not all of them. Most of them are Spaniards. They are the sons of colonizers, the Spanish colonizers who mixed in. But a lot of them, especially the ones that are still in Mexico, a lot of them are still connected to their ancestry. Who are today's Black Americans in the Midwest? That's Illinois, Missouri, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, etc. So Wisconsin, Iowa, yeah. So who they really are. The Inuit Confederacy, Anish, I can't pronounce that. Miami, Ho-Chunk, Shawnee, Blackfoot, and Mound Builders, Dina and Hopewell. So freedmen and Moors who moved north after Reconstruction and Jim Crow persecution in the South. These families were destroyed indigenous towns. So these families were from destroyed indigenous towns, and they relocated during the Trail of Tears, or others were forced into forced migrations where they had to move off their land, and they ended up in the Midwest. What happened? Their mound cities were bulldozed or buried under major U.S. cities. Many became colored factory workers during the industrial boom and Great Migration, and others lived in all-black farming towns like Nicodemus, Kansas, or Brooklyn, Illinois, which were later erased or absorbed. Let's talk about who today's Black Americans are in the South. That's Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Florida. Okay, who they really are: Yamasee, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Chautauqua, Cheraw, Gullah Geechee, and Washita Demundia, excuse me. So Moors and free indigenous families who owned land, ran businesses, and intermarried with European settlers. All right, because that was during the time of when, like I said, the West was being taken over. All right. Refugees of the Indian Removal Act from 1830, and they were also refugees of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and they were survivors of paper genocide who were rebranded as Negroes under the one drop rule. What happened? Entire towns were burned, like Rosewood, Florida, Greenwood, Oklahoma, or drowned like Lake Martin or Lake Lanier. Land was stolen using taxes, violence, and fraudulent deeds. And the original people were stripped of tribal names and given slave names, even if they were never enslaved, just to fit their narrative. All right, so let's go a little bit deeper into the destruction of our land, our memory, and our legacy, and how the Siberian hijackers was the final phase of erasure. So let's talk about when we owned the land and how they knew it. Look at these pictures. These are pictures of pyramids in America. This is a picture of what like the globe looked like around that time. Even though we know we don't live on the globe, this is just a picture depicting it that way. These are mummies found in Mexico, Egypt, and Indonesia, which all of which are DNA considered so-called Black American. And then if you look at these symbols, this is going to tell you something. This tells you that you were conquered and copied. Okay, look at Egypt's sign in 31 BCE. This is not an eagle; it's a falcon. And they literally just every time they conquered one of our nations, they mixed in with the nation as much as they could and changed the history, stole the identity, and rebranded, like how corporations do when they are losing something, like when they go close to getting into bankruptcy or something. Hold on. When they get close into being into like bankruptcy or something, businesses like to rebrand and hey, y'all make sure y'all not unmuting yourself. Alicia, your phone keeps going off mute. But corporations rebrand themselves once they going through stuff like that. So if you look, like I said, this is our symbol. This was a falcon. Then Persia stole it and changed it. Rome sold it, and here we are in America, where America is showing an eagle, which we'll talk about that in detail later on in this presentation. I don't know if it's going to be today or not, depending on how much we do. But long before the term United States existed, the original American peoples, the Moors, Yamasee, Washita, Lenape, Powhatan, and others held private land all across what we now call North America. And not just teepees and trail grounds. We're talking structured townships, advanced water systems, sophisticated agriculture, maritime ports, star-aligned agriculture, aqueducts, and pyramid mounds rivaling anything in Egypt. Okay, the land was not given to us, it was ours. It was passed down matrilineally, stewarded with sacred law, and protected with treaty and bloodline. Treaty and bloodline. So we are children of the soil. We literally come from the soil of this country, what we call a country today, which was our land. It was gifted to us. Okay, and we are the stewards of it, so we're supposed to be maintaining it according to our ancestors and DNA, but they have erased it and took it away from us, and everything that belonged to us they are perverting and repackaging it to us. Okay, so how they destroyed our advanced civilizations. Once the Europeans realized that we knew how to farm and harvest with lunar cycles, had underground cities and sacred springs, used copper for healing and energetic conductivity, mapped the stars to control weather and harvest, had advanced spiritual systems with real world results. They had one choice: erase it all, and they did. Not only did they erase it, the things that they decided to keep, they rebranded, like I said, how corporations do. So let's talk about all of the flooding that they did to our entire towns. There were entire towns that were drowned under artificial lakes. This is why they tell you in school that lakes are man-made. There are only I think it's only like one or two lakes in the United States that are naturally occurring, but most of the lakes are man-made, and this is why. They were drowned out. Some examples include Lake Martin in Alabama, Lake Lanier in Georgia, Lake Hartwell in South Carolina. It's on the South Carolina-Georgia border, and Lake Marion in South Carolina. These aren't natural lakes. These are intentional floods of thriving indigenous towns. So these are all actual pictures of those places. These were towns that belonged to our ancestors. And if you ever heard anything about Lake Lanier, you'll know that lake is our ancestors ain't playing. A lot of people done drowned in that lake. They not playing. Burning. Okay, everybody knows about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is the most famous, but there were over 30 other similar towns in Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Maryland, and all of them were either burned, bombed, or buried. Okay, fun fact: Black in quotations Wall Street was actually the original Wall Street. So the Wall Street in Virginia is a copied perversion of what Black Wall Street was. Okay, they learn how to trade and all that kind of stuff from us, but they're doing it incorrectly. They all of their um deals go bad because they don't know business. Legal land theft. Land was eminent domain for railroads, highways, and development. Heirs were tricked into signing deeds under fraudulent names. Others had land taken because their Negro status disqualified them from inheritance under reclassification laws. So again, every time they reclassified us, they took something from us. And this is how they were able to usurp the land through their caste system that they forced on us. This is what we once knew. We weren't barefoot jungle dwellers that was propaganded. We had hailing technologies using herbs, sound frequencies, and light. Trade routes spanning the entire continent, including maritime trade with the so-called Old World. So we were very connected to our ancestors all the way to the point where we could reconnect with them at will. Okay. Land-based common law rooted in natural rights, not Roman statutes. Mound systems that track equinoxes and solstices better than modern observatories. And private land trusts and spiritual stewardship contracts passed down by oral covenant We did not have to have a physical record because our word was and still is our bond. We say that in the so-called Black community. My word is my bond, because that's how we made contracts verbally. We weren't learning from the settlers; they were learning from us, and then they killed the teachers. So let's get into the Siberian hijack and who they really are. The so-called Native Americans seen today, the feather-wearing, casino-running, reservation-living representatives, are not the original people of this land. Most descend from Siberia and Mongolia migratory groups, and they were brought here by the United States government. Actually, I forget the years that this was, but when they first came here, they were Chinese. They called themselves Chinese, a lot of them. And then they got reclassified as well. So a lot of Chinese people got turned into Native Americans. Why? Because the real Americans were too advanced, knew the land too well, and held the rightful claim to it through treaties, blood, and law. The Siberians were poor, illiterate, spiritually disconnected from the land, and easier to control, manipulate, and parade. So they were placed on reservations and told, "You're the new face of Native America now." And what happened? They became silent placeholders for our legacy, but the land didn't recognize them. All right. If you look on these pictures, these are brown skin like us, and these are the original pictures. This is the Custer War. It wasn't called that, but General Custer had held this what they call it, battle line or regalia, whatever, against us. This is like the Cowboys and Indians thing that they showed you on TV with Clint Eastwood, and this is a picture of when they first came over. As you can see, they're bringing over their religion, and they're also brown skinned with some have longer straight hair and others have woolly hair, just like they said in the descriptions of how the true Indians looked. Also, just because you think we're black, this is to people who are not so-called black, but just because you think we're black does not mean that we're African, one, and two, it does not mean all of us have the same texture of hair. Some of us have looser curls, wavier hair, softer, less coarse. So our hair varies. We're not just stuck to one way like Africans. So these Native Americans of today live in poverty, on reservations with no plumbing, with alcohol abuse rates higher than any other group, and with no memory or spiritual ties to the soil beneath them. If they were truly the original stewards, wouldn't their land respawn? Wouldn't the knowledge flow? It doesn't, because it never belonged to them. These are actual pictures of a reservation and how they live. Don't you think if they were the true people of the land who were building these advanced civilizations, if they were the true descendants of them, don't you think they would not be living like this and actually build nice places for them to live? And the saddest part about it is that the government puts them in the middle of nowhere, literally. It puts them in the middle of nowhere and leaves them there. And most of them, because of how reservations are ran, they never get to leave that reservation. Their schools are on that reservation. Everything they need to do is on the reservation. And most of the things that they, say for instance, need to go out and get, their chiefs take care of all of that. So they are very reserved, kept people. So we can't really fault them for not seeing the truth, because in my opinion, is what I call them. They're federal babies. They're the government's babies. So they are highly brainwashed. The final phase of the lie. Once our towns were burned, our names were changed, and our lineages erased, they staged national museums with whitewashed narratives, propped up Siberian decoys as Indians, labeled us African to kill our indigenous rights, and flooded our homelands to bury the bones and the records. They left us with nothing but trauma and television, but our DNA never forgot. And also, if you look into some of the Native American museums, you will see who. Let me tell you. Let me ask you guys this: who are the only people who use picks for their hair? Y'all can answer it loud, or you can put it in the chat. Who are the only people who use picks for their hair? I don't know anybody else that use picks besides who.
Us. Never seen nobody but us.
There we go. So in that museum, I think it's the Navajo Indian Museum, they have wooden picks in there. I never seen one of them pick their hair ever. Like, so it's a lot of stuff in those museums if you are awakened to, the truth. And I still use a pick too. I have a wooden one. um, if you are awakened to the truth, you will see a lot of stuff in those museums that belong to us. All right, so the truth. They never want it told. We held the private land trust. We knew how to live with the earth, not on top of her. We built civilizations with knowledge now called lost. And we were erased so they would rule what they didn't create. The reservations are false temples. The Siberians are actors in a play written by our oppressors and their own. And we are the forgotten heirs waiting to reclaim the throne. So us remembering is causing a lot of stuff to happen. Exactly. Some Mexicans, because those Mexicans are related to the originals, which are the Olmecs. Olmecs are our people. We were everywhere. This land was ran by us. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as ICRA. Let's talk about 25 USC section 1301 through 1304. The Indian Civil Rights Act was enacted to apply many of the protections from the United States Constitution's Bill of Rights to tribal governments. However, it's not a gift. It's another mechanism for federal oversight. Here are some key definitions from Section 1301. The first one is Indian tribe. This is out of their laws, okay? So Indian tribe is a federally recognized tribes with self-government powers. So these tribes had what? Self-government powers. They had their own sovereignty. They can govern themselves. Then you have powers of self-government. That's legislative, executive, and judicial authority recognized as inherent, meaning it already existed and it was not granted by Congress, meaning that we were already sovereign and we already ran our own affairs when it came to legislation, executive, and judicial authority. Next is Indian court. They are tribal courts or courts of Indian offense, and those are created by the United States government. All right, so remember these definitions as we dive in more. First, you have constitutional rights in Section 1302. This is the tribes exercising self-government. This is what they cannot do anymore. Listen to how they stole our rights. All right, tribes exercising self-government cannot restrict free speech, religion, press, or the right to assemble. Listen to this. These were already written, guys, and they came in perverted them. Okay? They came and perverted what belonged to us. So again, the Constitution writes in Section 1302, tribes exercising self-government cannot restrict free speech, religion, press, or the right to assemble. They cannot violate protections against unreasonable searches. They cannot try someone twice for the same offense. That's called double jeopardy. They cannot force self-incrimination or take private property without compensation, and they cannot deny a speedy trial with a jury trial or access to counsel. Punishment limits for most offenses: the max is 1 year in prison or $5,000 fine, with specific criteria up to 3 years, which is $15,000 per offense, max 9 years total. And it must provide licensed legal counsel for long-term sentences and publish rules publicly. Moving on, habeas corpus, Section 1303. If someone believes they're unlawfully detained by a tribe, they can challenge it in a United States federal court. So they literally were putting us into their system and putting restrictions on us on how we can handle them. It's so crazy when you dig into this history. All lawyers aren't licensed. Really, it's not even really a license. It's just it's a membership, the bar association. You pay your dues and then you get these privileges and stuff like that. It's like a club. It's a PMA, a private members association. That's what it is. Domestic violence jurisdiction, Section 1304. A later amendment, which was added in 2013 to 2018, allows participating tribes to prosecute domestic violence cases, even against non-Indians, if the non-Indian lives, works, or is in a relationship with the tribe, within the tribe, or the act occurred in Indian country. But if neither party is Indian, the tribe has no jurisdiction. Tribes must still provide constitutional level protections, jury trials, due process, effective legal counsel, notify detained persons of rights to federal habeas review, and receive DOJ, Department of Justice grants for strengthening courts, jails, victim services, and legal procedures. This jurisdiction is limited and does not replace federal or state prosecution power. All right, let's keep going. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. This act authorized the president to negotiate with Native American tribes to relocate them west of the Mississippi River in exchange for their ancestral homelands. This stuff is not hidden. That's what I be telling people. This stuff is not hidden. It's in the history. It's just the history they taught you in school, and the way they taught you in school makes you not go past what they taught you in school, and that's on purpose. Because this stuff is not hidden. When you start looking into and reading certain things, you it's right in your face. So the reality, though phrased as voluntary relocation, it was backed by military force, coercion, and deceit. So they try to make it seem like we gave up our land voluntarily. Everything that they put on that paper is a lie. It gave them legal cover for massive land theft from tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. And it directly led to the Trail of Tears, where thousands died during forced relocations due to disease, hunger, and exposure. The purpose of them doing this was to land grab for white settlers and United States corporation expansion. Claimed to protect tribes from extinction, but actively dismantled their nations and sovereignty, and treated indigenous people as obstacles, to progress and not as sovereign nations. So it basically made them seem like they were a pest because they were fighting for what was theirs. Really messed up. So let's connect the two laws. First, we're going to go into the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and then the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968. So it legalized ethnic cleansing and removal, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It masked colonial conquest as relocation. It led to genocide and land theft. It created dependency on United States corporation legal system, and it pushed tribes off their land on paper. And then the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 legalized conditional sovereignty. It masked federal control as rights protection. It limits indigenous punishment and jurisdiction, and it reinforces dependency with legal caps and oversight by keeping tribes in a legal box where they are never fully sovereign. All right, so the Indian Removal Act strips tribes of their land under false pretenses, while the Indian Civil Rights Act, while seemingly empowering, reinforces conditional autonomy. So you can be free sometimes, not all the time. Tribes have power, but only so long as it aligns with the United States corporation legal norms. This is sovereignty under surveillance. So if a people must ask permission to use their power, are they truly sovereign or just managed? The Indian Removal Act of 1830's true purpose was relocation. That was a cover word. Okay, this was a legal land heist. This was to remove the rightful landowners, dark-skinned indigenous tribes, from their ancestral land in the southeastern United States, to void treaties that had been made with tribal nations guaranteeing them sovereignty and land rights, to erase the tribal titles so that private European families and corporations could claim the land under United States jurisdiction, and to destroy tribal infrastructure, economic, spiritual, and legal, so the land could be absorbed into the growing federal empire. So what really happened was tribes like the Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole had schools, governments, constitutions, agricultural systems, and advanced societies. These tribes were not nomadic savages. They were farming, trading, and defending lands that had been theirs for thousands of years. The act gave the government power to negotiate removal treaties, but in reality, it was coercion backed by military force. Entire communities were rounded up and marched west at gunpoint in the Trail of Tears, which killed thousands. Why it was really passed. to dissolve the sovereignty of American Indian nations, to seize valuable lands in Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and Mississippi, especially lands known to have gold, growing cotton potential, and key trade access, to replace tribal governance with United States law and colonial order, and ultimately to remove the presence of dark-skinned sovereign people that challenge the lie of white supremacy and manifest destiny. The Indian Removal Act wasn't just about helping Indians like they try to make it. It was about erasing the real heirs to make room for the false narrative of European dominance. The true purpose of the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968. Rights were the bait, control was the trap. To extend United States federal legal control over sovereignty tribal nations without directly destroying them through war or removal, to bring tribal governments under United States constitutional standards, especially in how they handle due process, speech, and persecution, to erode tribal sovereignty through integration and dependency rather than open conflicts. So what it really did, on the surface, it guaranteed civil rights like free speech and protection from unlawful search and seizure without tribal jurisdiction. But in reality, it meant tribal courts were now subject to United States legal expectations. The United States could monitor, control, and infiltrate tribal governments. It allowed for federal oversight of tribal justice systems, weakened indigenous self-governance, and it put Indians under a new status, federally recognized wards, and not independent nations. Why it was really passed. By the 1960s, indigenous people were waking back up and demanding their land and rights. So the United States saw that open war wouldn't work anymore, and they needed legal camouflage. So this act functioned as a treaty override, neutralizing tribal power by appearing to offer protection. It was also damage control after decades of public exposure of abuse against the true Americans, Native Americans, us, we the true natives of this land, of the Americas. So the United States needed a PR win while still maintaining control. All right, so let's get more into this. The bigger truth of it all is that both acts were part of the same strategy to erase, remove, rebrand, and repurpose the original people of the land while flooding their territories with white settlers, corporations, and puppet tribal governments. The Indian Removal Act physically displaced the bodies, and the Indian Civil Rights Act mentally and legally displaced the authority. So they worked hand in hand. All right, let's talk about this. Is a very interesting time in history that I don't feel like we learn about much in school. Like they touch on it a little bit when I was in school. I think they touched on it very briefly, but we really didn't go into it like that. But let's talk about Bacon's Rebellion, which happened in 1676. This was the rebellion that terrified the elite, and we're going to get into why. So this happened in Virginia colony, okay? And this was led by Nathaniel Bacon, which was a white English aristocrat that had beef against the colonial governor. Who joined him? Enslaved melanated tribal people were classified as Negroes, indentured Europeans, which was mostly the Irish, Scottish, German, and Slavic, and then poor farmers, freedmen, and displaced so-called Native Americans. Okay, at this time, I say so-called Native Americans because that's not who we are. Okay, we're native to this land, but we're not Native Americans. These were not all slaves. They were landless people of every color, rising against the elite class that was hoarding power, wealth, and land. So let's talk about what really happened during Bacon's Rebellion. The Virginia colony was being run like a corporate plantation by elites, most notably Governor William Berkeley, who was protecting wealthy interests and cutting secret land deals with local tribes to benefit himself and his clique. But poor Europeans and reclassified indigenous people were getting nothing, no land, no justice, no future. And so what they did to get a lot of the Europeans to come over here is they told them, if you come to America, you'll be able to eat off the land and have a good life. But when they got here, it was the total opposite because the aristocratic rich ones, which was a very small group, they were making deals where they weren't holding up to their end of the deals and not really giving a crap about the poor Europeans that they told to come over here. Okay, but poor Europeans again, and reclassified indigenous people were getting nothing, no land, no justice, no future. They were used as buffer labor, militia pawns, and tax fodder. So Nathaniel Bacon, which was a rich cousin of Berkeley, so Nathaniel Bacon was William Berkeley's cousin, and he felt shut out of power. He felt exploited by the rage of the landless class and pulled together a multiracial rebellion demanding protection from native raids, which were being intentionally allowed for land grab deals, equal access to land and resources, and into the corrupt favoritism of the colonial government. Then it turned into something much bigger. They ended up burning down Jamestown. They burnt it to the ground. They burnt the entire capital of the Virginia colony, and for a moment, black and white, bonded and free, stood together against the empire. They realized they had a common enemy, and that was the ruling class and not each other. So this is why the elites panicked. They panicked because the colonial governors and European investors saw the real threat, and that was poor whites plus melanated indigenous, which equaled an unstoppable force. They knew that if these groups united, no plantation, fort, or commercial enterprise would be safe, and they needed to divide them immediately and permanently. So, this is what happened after the rebellion was crushed. This is Nathaniel Bacon, by the way. Bacon died mysteriously. He was possibly poisoned. The rebellion was crushed with military force, but the fear it ignited shaped American policy for centuries. And here's what they did in response. First, it invented the term white, so it invented whiteness. Before this, there was no white identity. People were English, Irish, Welsh, German, etc. New laws gave special legal status to European descent only, regardless of class. And indentured whites were promised land and protection if they aligned with the ruling class and rejected their black native comrades. Okay? It codified blackness as permanent slavery. Melanated people, many of whom were indigenous to the land or more with status, were now officially categorized as Negro slaves, non-human property. Okay? Even for free black people were stripped of rights, land, and recognition, and the paper genocide began here. Tribal people were erased from documents, renamed, and thrown into the slave column. So this is when they was like, look, since y'all want to be getting together, we're going to make y'all separate. We're going to divide you guys. This is when laws were passed that forbid interracial solidarity. So no more interracial marriage, military alliances, or shared living quarters. Because at one point, like I said, the ghettos, the Europeans, the white Europeans, and the so-called white Europeans and the so-called black Indians, we lived in the same places. So then severe penalties were imposed on whites who helped or sided with Negroes/Indians. This is a story about so-called white man falling in love with a so-called black woman, and they had to go through trial for this. They got persecuted for this. Persecuted, however you say it. So, what was Bacon's rebellion really about? It was the first American uprising against corporate colonial rule, a multi-ethnic revolt for land justice and human dignity. It revealed that race was not natural, it was manufactured as control, that the colonial system feared class unity more than anything, and that America was built on division, not freedom. Had Bacon's rebellion succeeded long term, we would not have had a racial caste system. There would be no black or white. There would have been landed tribes and poor settlers running America together. But instead, the elite wrote the script for the next 400 years of psychological slavery. All right, let's get into it. This is Francis Bacon. He said, "Truth will sooner come out of error than confusion." Truth will sooner come out of error than confusion. And as we're learning all of this stuff, we're realizing that they made a lot of errors and the truth is coming out because a lot of the stuff that they said happened a certain way. Because you cannot tell a lie the same way twice, it's just not adding up. The math is not mathing. He also said people prefer to believe what they want to be true. People prefer to believe what they want to be true. So people will lie to themselves just to make something that is false a reality. All right. He also said knowledge is power. Is it not? The more you know, the more you grow. I've been saying that for a while now. He also said the divisions of science are not like different lines that meet in one angle, but rather like the branches of trees that join in one trunk. The divisions of science, meaning all of the science that they were coming out with at that time to divide people into different classifications like Mongoloid, Negroid, Caucasus and all that kind of stuff, or Caucasian, whatever. All of those divisions of man-made science are not like different lines that meet in one angle, but rather like the branches of trees that join in one trunk, meaning everybody is connected to the same source one way or another. All right. Here's another one of his quotes. Some books should be tasted, some devoured, but only a few should be chewed and digested thoroughly. Some books should be tasted, some devoured, but only a few should be chewed and digested thoroughly. He's telling you that the books that his family and his people brought over or was writing through history, he's telling you that a lot of the books aren't something that you should take with, you know, full confidence. Some of them you test the water with them. Some of them you eat the whole thing, but you don't chew it all and digest it because most of it is not digestible. Let's talk about how Black Americans ended up on plantations alongside poor white slaves. All right. The plantation system wasn't a racial structure first. It was a land control and labor domination model born in feudal Europe and exported to America. All right. Truths. Many Black Americans weren't shipped here from Africa. They were already here as indigenous people and Moors. Poor white Europeans, mostly Slavic peasants, Irish indentured servants, and Germanic war refugees were sent here in chains under contract servitude, debt bondage, or as punishment. The ruling class, British, Dutch, French, and Spanish elites, needed a caste system that divided the landed indigenous heirs and the poor European migrants to prevent uprising and unification again. So they came out with the great trick: divide by race, conquer by paper. All right, so before the Civil War, there was no such thing as white people or black people. There were tribal people, nationals, indentured servants, landholders, and freemen. But after the Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when poor Europeans and melanated indigenous people fought side by side against the elite, laws were passed to create the legal invention of whiteness as a protected class, reclassify tribal people as Negroes or slaves, and promote European migrants to overseer or patrol status in exchange for loyalty. So this is when the so-called slave patrol was erected. They gave the so-called white people a position of authority and pretty much put them over top of the so-called black people and gave them rewards for patrolling them. All right. It was actually a law that was passed that if so-called black people got caught congregating, like talking in circles on a corner or something, that they can be arrested or put to death or something like that. So this is when you started seeing black people on plantations, many of whom had been war prisoners, captured tribal leaders, or wrongfully reclassified as freedmen, and they pretty much just needed a job because everything was turned off like for them. They didn't have opportunity to go and make money because all our land and stuff was stolen. So everything that they stole from us, we had to go back to them and ask them permission for a piece, a crumb. Please, master, may I have a crumb? And he gives you a half a crumb. That's the workforce to this day. They are modern day plantations. But the Civil War is not what you were told. The Civil War wasn't just about freeing slaves. It was about the final takeover of sovereign tribal territories across the South and West, eliminating black confederacies and indigenous towns that had their own money, land, and law, and forcing everyone, black, white, native, poor, under a single commercial system of United States citizenship and federal debt. Europe was watching and funding both sides. Why? Because whoever controlled America's landmass controlled the global empire, and this was a multi-nation conquest camouflaged as an internal dispute. So they made it look like what they tell you in history with the Civil War is that it was a fight against brothers. Oh, it was the fight against the South and the North. They lie to you and they tell you that, right? But really, all of the nations who are what we know as today, the United Nations, they came together and they just play both sides against the middle and they just watch it happen because they create the chaos and the control. All right. Let's talk about the Buffalo Soldiers and how they were used for weaponized betrayal. Now let's talk betrayal, not from hate, but from desperation. Who were the Buffalo Soldiers? They were dark-skinned indigenous and free men, many from tribes like Seminole, Creek, Choctaw, Chattawba. I hope I'm saying it right. And Cherokee. Um, they were recruited by the United States Army to serve the very government that had displaced and reclassified their families, and they were promised land, pensions, and American status in exchange for military service. So, what they tell you about the Buffalo Soldiers, anybody that is so-called black in history that we know of positively, and they like put them on a high pedestal, just know they had something they did that wasn't beneficial to us, which made them put them up on a pedestal, or they could be related to them somehow, which we'll talk about later on in this history session thing. But a lot of the people that were Buffalo Soldiers, this how it went down. Our families were still classifying ourselves as the tribes that we came from. We still were holding on to the land that we had, especially those in the West, because their conquering happened a little later when the settlers and all that kind of stuff start coming through. So the Buffalo Soldiers wanted to get that classification of the white man, because around that time being white was all right, and it made people want to be white. So these poor displaced Indians got an opportunity that they felt like was a golden ticket into the white man's promised land and new way of life. And they decided that, hey, we're not going to keep on going with this old stuff to their families. We don't want to keep calling on these different tribes. This is not helping us. Can't you see they killing us? So we can't beat them. So we're going to join them. So what they did, they were sent to the West to fight and kill their own bloodline, which now is reclassified as hostile Indians. So they enlisted into the white man's army, and they got roles in the army that made them feel special in the white man's system. And they were told by the white men that the people they were killing were hostile. Meanwhile, this was their own people. They told them they were hostile Indians, and they told them that they needed them to build railroads, protect settlers, and enforce Indian policy. So these Buffalo Soldiers were like black police officers. That's modern day. What a Buffalo Soldier would be is a black police officer or a black person that enters the military at will, voluntarily, not through drafting. Somebody who wants to be in these systems. That is what a Buffalo Soldier would be. All right. So Buffalo Soldiers were used because they knew the land. So they knew where their people could be. And they helped nose them out and kill them so their land can be taken and repurposed for the new white settlers in the plains that they were trying to conquer. They killed off the buffalo, which was a sacred life source to the Plains tribes, and then they starved them into reservation compliance. So that's why they were called Buffalo Soldiers. Okay, they make a lot of documentaries about the Buffalo Soldiers. They try to make them seem like they are Black American history heroes, but they are just pawns that were used to weaponize betrayal against their own. The psychological warfare, European daughters as white bait. To seal the betrayal, Buffalo Soldiers were incentivized with marriage to European migrant daughters of Irish, Polish, Jewish, and Slavic descent. These were girls who came from poor families that saw a soldier as a step up. So if you were a Buffalo Soldier and you were just doing what you were supposed to do for the white government, and you became like in higher ranking or loyal to them, you were rewarded with a white very young girl. You could be a man in your 40s or 50s, and they would reward you with a white girl in her teens or early 20s, and you could marry her. These women were strategically paired to breed loyalty and further assimilate the bloodline. Families gave away daughters in hopes of being elevated, granted access to land, jobs, and the white classification. And over time, this mixed lineage disconnected children from their indigenous roots, especially when records were changed to mark them as colored or mulatto. Okay? So these unions were not based in love, They were military incentives, social experiments, and tools of bloodline dilution and cultural severance. Because listen, the white men felt like if you were obedient to them, then you were one of the good Negroes that they could control. So it was okay for you to interbreed with their um so-called white lineage because you're all right. You went white and you went all right. You showed your loyalty to the master. The outcome, a broken lineage and a silent war. So all of this was part of so the Buffalo Soldiers were never accepted as white, no matter who they married or how loyal they were. Their children were cut off from tribal claims and removed from land rolls and became black Americans in the system. So it didn't even matter for them to do what they did. It didn't even benefit them. It didn't even benefit them to sell out their people. And a lot of them died at young ages due to all of the, hard stuff they had them doing, the dirty work. They had them doing the dirty work. So the European migrants gained more by siding with the elite and eventually absorbed into the white classification. So it was a win for the European migrants, but it was a lose for the so-called Black Buffalo Soldier because if the child came out under that one drop classification, even though that came out years later in 1924, it was something that was already scientifically going around in their, communities before it was a law. It just took one with big balls to make it a law. Okay, but they already had their ways for classifying people and choosing which ones they want to let into their society and which ones they don't want into their society. So it was pretty much whichever one you look the most like is the one you would be. So if the child came out and it looked more European, then it would be classified as white. But if the child came out and it looked more Native American, not Native American, I don't know why I keep saying that, but American Indian, then or so-called black, then it will be a black American or a Negro or colored or whatever at the time. So all of this was part of a 400-year plan to erase the original Americans through ink, birth, and battlefield. We're going to go even deeper into this because the things that they've done, social engineering, the social engineering that they've done is just really deep. And a lot of it is through us giving them consent without saying it. So it's called implied consent. I talk about that a lot. So let's move on. Truth. They didn't just erase our identity, they weaponized our pain, our honor, and our love of freedom to turn us against ourselves. The Buffalo Soldiers didn't know they were enforcing their own genocide because at the time, to them, it seemed progressive what they were doing. It seemed like in that current time, this is the better decision for me and my future to go ahead and join this white man's regalia and work under him because he's in control right now. And if I can get close to what he's controlling, then maybe I can get a piece of the pie for my ancestors. Now realizing that every piece of pie that they already had and needed for many generations, they already had. And they traded that to be in a system that labeled them 3/5 of a human. So the poor whites didn't know they were pawns in the empire's hierarchy of whiteness, and the tribal heirs, now called so-called black, were left landless, nameless, and nationless until now because we're remembering. So why so-called black people were forbidden to read? Let's talk about why it was illegal for so-called black people to read. Because reading equaled remembering. The system knew that if we read, we'd remember who we were, and the knowledge would break the plantation spell. The truth. From the early 1700s to mid 1800s, across the South and even parts of the North, there were explicit laws that criminalized black literacy. If an enslaved person or even a free black was caught reading or teaching others to read, they could be whipped, mutilated, jailed, sold further south into harsher bondage, or executed, especially if the material was political, spiritual, or historical. So if you were trying to help others by teaching them about what's going on, because the Europeans wrote everything in books, and they brainwashed us so much that they had a saying, you want to hide something from a Negro, put it in a book. Because they had literally traumatized our people from touching books. So they knew psychologically it was programmed in our DNA through epigenetics. Epigenetics is trauma being passed through the blood. Okay, so you're going to pick that up even if you weren't alive during those times, and it subconsciously will make you not want to read. This is years of psychological programming that has kind of like been embedded in our DNA and passed down without us even realizing it. So here are some historical examples, all right? This is the Virginia 19, anti-literacy laws. This law was passed stating that any person who shall teach any slave to read or write shall be punished by fine or imprisonment. This was from the Boston Liberator, April 26, 1893. It's showing the anti-literacy law that was passed in 1819. All right. It says in Virginia, should free Negroes or their children assemble at a school to learn reading or writing, any justice of the peace may dismiss the school with 20 stripes on the back for every pupil. So they really whip them for doing that. It says in Louisiana, the penalty for instructing a free black in a Sunday school is for the first offense $500, for the second offense death. All right. Here is another example from South Carolina, 1740. After the Stono Rebellion, a multi-tribal uprising of enslaved indigenous Americans, a law was passed that teaching a slave to read or write or allowing them to gather in educational groups is a crime. So what I'm doing with you guys right now, if we were around during that time, I would be put to death because I wouldn't stop. They would have to kill me and I'd come back and do it again. And that's probably why I'm doing it now, because I've been killed many times for speaking truth, because that's what I stand on. But anyway, there were many upheavals. There were many rebellions where we fought them. We did not give up easy. So don't think or don't believe the lies that they told us during it, like throughout school and throughout all of this social programming, that we were literally, especially our men. Now let me ask y'all this question. How many so-called black men do you know that will allow a so-called white man to bend them over and buck break them in front of the whole community and do nothing and become his loyal servant? How many black men do you know that would do that? Y'all can unmute yourself and answer, because I don't know any. And I'm
None.
going back. Yeah, I'm going way back. I don't
None.
know any.
I don't know any.
Not me.
Exactly. So why would they teach us that? They would teach us that so that we can become more docile. This is also why they imprisoned many of our men who were related to tribal leaders, or many of our men just in general, because they wanted to make them docile through caging them like animals and poisoning their food. So a lot of people be like, all of them niggas in jail, and none of them don't overthrow the jail, and it's more of them, and some of them real killers. Yeah, because many of them have been docile into. They, first of all, not only do they feed them heavy metals in their food, but they also play frequencies quietly all the time that can induce different things to happen. So if they want them to fight, they can put it up, turn it up to make them fight. Like, not only that, when you're in custody and you're awarded a state, seriously at that point being in jail, whenever it's a new vaccination or any of those things that has to come out, you cannot say you don't want it unless it's for religious exemptions, and even still they kind of get their rights taken from them, sadly. Here's another one from Alabama, 1833. It says, any free person of color or slave who writes, reads, or attempts to learn shall be punished by lashes on the bare back. So they beat us into saying what they wanted us to say and doing what they wanted us to do. This is also why they had a slave Bible, which was completely different from the Bible that had all the true stuff about who we are in it. They took out things, they changed things up, and your so-called master, because again, you were never enslaved, okay? So you were just under a system that enslaved you on paper. All right. So your so-called master, or whoever the master of that plantation was, they would get their favorite, most obedient slave who knew the Bible, and they would oversee them while they read it to the others in the plantation, the other so-called slaves. We know we weren't slaves, but the other people, the prisoners. They would watch them through their sermons and make sure that they don't teach them anything outside of what they approved to keep them in control, like slaves obey your masters. They weren't afraid of books. They were afraid of which books? Books that confirmed the indigenous bloodline of so-called blacks, the land ownership and treaties that still existed, the real meaning of legal terms like person, estate, and sovereign, the Moorish history and noble status that predated colonialization, and the biblical and legal truths that contradicted the slave narrative. They didn't want us to know that. So they did a book burning, historical censorship, and hidden archives. They didn't just ban books, they burned them. Whole collections of tribal records, Moorish law, indigenous treaties, and spiritual texts were destroyed by fire in uprisings they couldn't control. Removed from public libraries and locked away in private Masonic lodges, in Vatican vaults, and secret university collections, and rewritten and reprinted with revised history, inverted timelines, and whitewashed illustrations. So they went all out to make sure that even if we did get a hold of the books, well, guess what? If you're reading it, you're reading lies. So now we're going to reprogram what you know as history. We're going to change it. And the more you read it after every generation, then the more you'll believe that it's facts. Here are some notable examples. The Library of Congress did a cleanup, and they do campaigns. They were doing these campaigns in the 1800s and early 1900s, where they reclassified and removed countless documents related to the Washita, Yamasee, Catawba, and Moors. The WPA slave narratives of 1930s were altered. Elders' original accounts describing Native ancestry, supernatural events, and government betrayal were edited or redacted. Oh, the CIA has a lot of documents. Most of them are still classified, but some have been declassified, where they're telling you the powers that we possess. We do actually have supernatural powers. Okay, if you never heard of a guy, and this man was in Africa, but his name was Simeon Toko, and they killed that man 1,000,000 times, and he came back. So and he said, I'm just one. There's many more, and they're coming in the future. In so many words. So yeah, that's a good story to look up. But Christian Bibles and apocryphal texts with descriptions of dark-skinned prophets, messiahs, and angelic orders were removed from circulation or heavily revised by European translators. So this is a book here that they play games with. So, and what wasn't burnt, was rebranded. So this book is called the Book of Negroes, for example, which was once an official record of loyalist Moors and freedmen during the Revolutionary War. It became a tokenized term of victimhood in the public imagination. So they recreated the first original Book of Negroes was official record of loyalists, Moors, and freedmen during the Revolutionary War, but they rebranded the book and changed it to a book about victimhood, about slavery and stuff. So this is the bullshit recreation of the original book, and this one is filled with nonsense and lies, but it's like one of the top list books, and I think it was even like a book on Oprah's reading list or reading club. I know you guys remember she used to have them books that she would stamp or seal and say, these are books you should read. So she was getting also paid to push propagandized bullshit, because that's what this book is. Let's talk about how we always talk about like how we were programmed. Let's talk about how white people were programmed, because they too were also programmed. So this is how whites were programmed and made overseers of these lies. Let's get into it. White people, especially the poor, weren't free. They were mentally colonized, drafted into a caste system they didn't design, and then told they were better than a Negro to keep them loyal to their own oppressors. So everybody has been used as a pawn to pretty much get their points across. Whatever they wanted to get done, they would use whoever they need to use. So, like I always say, there are always casualties in a war. There's always going to be casualties in a war. So the process. Whiteness was invented as a psychological bribe. It gave poor Europeans a social identity in exchange for policing blacks. Indoctrination began in church and school. The catechism for white taught the Africans the catechism for whites taught that Africans were cursed descendants of Ham. So they said that we were Africans, and because we were African, we were cursed descendants of Ham. And a curse is to have black or dark skin. Civilization was framed as something brought by Europeans, erasing what the indigenous Moors had already had. Scientific racism emerged. Junk science like y'all make sure y'all are on mute. Make sure y'all are on mute. Somebody's phone is going off mute. Junk science like phrenology and eugenics taught whites that Negroes were biologically inferior, which is a lie. And they became soldiers of a lie, taught to fear black intelligence and criminalize black advancement. Loyalty was rewarded with land and opportunity. The Homestead Act, the GI Bill, and white only loans built a middle class of obedient citizens. But true power and ownership stayed with the elite white families and hidden European banking dynasties, which a lot of those Europeans are descendants of the dark-skinned original European Moors. Our so-called brother who sold us out because they were jealous of our empire and how old and ancient we were. We are much more ancient than Africa. Do not let them fool you. Africa is an invention of Rome. It is not a natural name for those lands. And those lands were not nowhere near and still aren't to this day as plentiful as it is here. This is why they're going to keep trying to get you to move to Africa. They want you to give up your land so that they can keep it. Truth. We weren't denied reading because we were dumb. We were denied because the truth in those books would have overthrown the entire system. And white people weren't educated, they were indoctrinated, taught that maintaining their fragile status meant defending a lie with guns, laws, and pulpits. They feared you knowing how to read, not because of knowledge, but because your remembrance will burn Babylon down again. Every empire that they build, we break. So we're facing now the last empire. This is the last empire, which will be cut clean with solar rays from the sky. Let's talk about banned, burned, or censored books. This is how deep they took it. This is a whole list, guys. If you can find these books, they'll probably be very expensive, but I'm gonna just still give them to you in case you want to look them up. So the first one is The Negroes in Negroland, written by Hinton Helper in 1868. Why it was banned? Because it documents African and indigenous customs that contradict the slave narrative. The truth revealed, so-called Negroes had complex civilizations, spiritual systems, and law long before European contact. So this book, The Negroes in Negroland, is letting you know how much we had already had here and how we couldn't be from Africa. The Negro Question Series by Lee Cummings. Why banned or suppressed? Because it reframes the Negro as the original American and biblical Hebrew. Truth Revealed. It dissects stolen identity, land, and misclassification through historical documentation. It's too much evidence. So the next time people try to tell you that you don't know what you're talking about, they have to come with some hard facts that can counteract what we're putting together. Because as long as these videos are, and as much evidence that I have in this presentation, it's like I don't think they're going to be able to counteract the lies because it's just all coming together. Like the truth is just so clear. The next book is Five Civilized Tribes in Indian Territory by Grant Foreman, written in 1934. Why it was censored? Because original editions reference Negro Indians and the United States betrayal of the tribal freemen. Truth Revealed. It shows the complex political structure of tribal nations and their reclassification as black. Too much proof. The next one is 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro by J.A. Rogers, 1934. Why banned in schools and libraries? Because it directly challenged the lie of racial inferiority by saying that we were stupid, we were dumb, we were the less superior race. The Truth Revealed highlights royal bloodlines, global contributions, and noble African, so-called African American and Moorish history. Even Donald Trump said it himself. And again, I don't care about politics. I understand the role he's playing. We'll talk about that too in this presentation later in it. But we have built this place. He said it, he knows it, and they know it as well. We built the place that they call home. A Prince Among Slaves by Terry Alfred, 1977. Why suppressed in academic circles? Because it tells the truth of Abdul Rahman Ibrahima, a West African prince enslaved in Mississippi. Truth Revealed. It confirms that many enslaved men were of royal status and not just African bushmen. So a lot of the people who were actual slaves with dark skin, some of them did come from Africa. Some of them did. It wasn't as many as they told you it was, and it wasn't in the way they told you it was in. It was basically they got promised something that they didn't get as well once they got over here. The Apocrypha, removed books of the Bible. Why banned by Protestant churches? Because it contains scriptures validating melanated prophets and Israelite bloodlines. The truth revealed in the book of Wisdom and Second Esdras reference dark-skinned prophecy and the fate of a scattered people. The Destruction of Black Civilizations by Chancellor Williams, written in 1971. Why blacklisted in colleges? It provides irrefutable proof of how black societies were dismantled from within and without. Truth Revealed. Strategically destroyed kingdoms, infiltration by interracial elites, and loss of sovereignty. The Holy Quran of the Moorish Science Temple, written by Noble Drew Ali in the 1920s. Why surveillance and remove? The United States government targeted the Moorish Science Temple as a threat to federal authority. Truth Revealed. It declares Moors as the true Americans, not Africans, and teaches national, not racial identity. Okay? It's a book that has a lot of sacred science in it as well. Slave Narratives, WPA Project, written from 1936 to 1938. Why censored or edited? Many elders spoke of native ancestry, freedom before enslavement, and government betrayal. Truth Revealed. Their original recordings were redacted or rewritten to match the Africa to America lie. They Came Before Columbus by Ivan van Sertima in 1976. Why widely attacked in academia? Because it proved that Africans and indigenous Moors were in America before Columbus. And Truth Revealed ship routes, maps, and artifacts linking so-called Negroes to ancient American civilizations. The original Black Hebrews Bible by cipher manuscripts by various artists. So why hidden or altered? Unedited versions contain genealogy, land inheritance, and prophecies tied to American Black people. Truth Revealed. It provides spiritual and bloodline sovereignty, names the enemy systems, and hidden alliances. Ancient and Modern Britons by David McRitchie in 1884. Why banned from United States schools? States that the original Britons were dark-skinned Moors, as I told you. The Truth Revealed. It challenges the entire racial structure of white Europe. Lost Tribes and Promised Lands by Ronald Sanders in 1980. Why limited print? Because it claims that Columbus met Hebrew-speaking natives in the Americas. And Truth Revealed because it ties so-called African Americans to the ancient Israelites in biblical prophecy and physical location. So it's too much proof. It's way too much proof. The New World Order by A. Ralph Epperson, written in 1990. Why suppressed? Because it connects global institutions, religion, and education systems to a long-standing plan to enslave the minds of the people. Truth Revealed. It points to a unified agenda against indigenous people globally, especially in the Americas. I already told you guys about the UN. That's the unified agenda against us. All right. So let's talk about the United States school system and how it was never built to educate, but to indoctrinate. And y'all know who this infamous person is here. All right. Original purpose was obedience and not wisdom. The public school system was designed in the mid to late 1800s following the Prussian model, not for enlightenment, but to manufacture obedient, manageable citizens to serve the elite industrial and colonial machine. We want one class to have a liberal education, and we want another class, a very much larger class, to forego the privilege of a liberal education. This is from Woodrow Wilson in 1909 before he became the United States president, and this is him here on this picture. All right. Core programming of public schooling. Erasure of true history. Textbooks whitewash colonialization, turn war criminals into heroes, and portray indigenous Americans as extinct or primitive. Black history starts at slavery, skipping nobility and land ownership and sovereignty. This is why they put you in school. Rote memorization, okay? Memorization, excuse me. Students are not taught how to think, but what to think. Every answer must fit state-sanctioned narratives, especially about race, identity, law, and economics. This is a picture of what they showed us in school. I know y'all seen this picture in school in a book when they were saying we were slaves. Well, when you look up this guy here, on this picture, he is actually African. He's not an indigenous American. He's an African slave. All right, there were slaves in Africa. Again, I told you Africans are extremely tribal. So if you were from a different tribe, and it didn't matter because all of them were the same color. But if you were from a different tribe, you could be a slave. And pretty much he's African. This was not even our descendant. But they use this picture all the time when out in the textbooks. Bell schedule conditioning. So when a buzzer rings, that means move, eat, stop, speak, obey. It trains children to respond to external authority like soldiers or factory workers. Because at work, especially when you work in a warehouse, they have bells and stuff like that too. So they're getting you ready for the workforce, even the way that schools are built. Compulsory pledge of allegiance. They make you do daily oaths to the flag, which is a ritual indoctrination to condition loyalty to a corporate government and not a nation of free people. Let's look at this pledge. Let's look over it. First of all, it's starting with I. So when you say I, that's automatic entrance of a contract because you're already starting off talking about your essence. So you're pledging your essence, allegiance to this flag, which all you guys should know by now. And if you don't, this is a war flag. Okay, this flag symbolizes us being at war. Okay, and to the republic for it says so you're pledging allegiance to this war flag of the United States corporation that took over America's because when you see United States of, that's a corporation. America is the land. So they're telling you the corporation that took over America, and to the republic, meaning every state inside every one of these stars is their own republic because it's like Texas Republic, Maryland Republic. Like I told you guys that before. So every state is its own franchise corporation, and it's inside of the greater corporation, the United States. So you're pledging not only allegiance to this war flag in your capture, because you're a prisoner of war, but you're also pledging allegiance to the republic that you're residing in that also has you under their jurisdiction. So it says for which it stands, meaning as it is, the way it is, one nation. They're saying that all of this is one nation that's under God. But who is God? What God is this nation under? And we'll talk about that a lot more deeper further down in this presentation. But the God they're talking about is the all-seeing eye on the back of the dollar bill, and that all-seeing eye is the surveillance of those in control. And we'll go deep into that later on. But indivisible with liberty and justice for all of who? All of the people that make up these republics, or all of the corporations that are disguising themselves as states. So they get you while you're young to pledge your allegiance, your loyalty to the corporation and their system. They also do segregation by class and IQ, which is also coded by race, because in those so-called black schools, they're always putting children under medication for behavioral stuff and all of that kind of stuff. But really, it's so much trauma, especially when you're growing up in poverty. It's so much trauma that you face by the time you get to school. Maybe you do got some disorders, but it's never what they say it is, because what they try to label you as is something they created just so that they can medicate you. But you have gifted programs versus special ed, which often track along racial lines. So you'll have more what they call minorities in special ed classes than you will have so-called white children. Okay, generational geniuses in the so-called black in so-called black children is systemically redirected toward athletics or basic labor. So there are a lot of very very highly intelligent so-called black children who, depending on the way the school system is set up, not many of them are recognized for their intelligence. They're just made to seem normal. So let's talk about erasure of indigenous identity. Children from families with indigenous Moorish roots are marked African American, which cuts off legal ties to the land and history. Public school is not education, it's domestication. So if you look at these pictures that I have here, this is what they did during those school times, which I call public humiliation rituals, where they will spank your hand or your behind in front of the entire class, and then they will make you wear a cap that says dunce, that's a pyramid, and sit in the corner. And dunce, we'll go into that. But the paddle whippings in front of the class, I have a typo there, and then making you wear a dunce cap, dunce meaning a person who is slow at learning, a stupid person, and still facing the wall in the corner, were used in early days of school, and it was a humiliation ritual. So that's how they were getting the children to obey. Bonus: why they keep Siberian Native Americans isolated on reservations. And this is a actual reservation here. The reason for Indian reservations: contrary to popular belief, reservations were not reparations. They were containment camps for a decoy population meant to act as the face of indigenous America, while the true aboriginals were reclassified as Negroes, colors, and later black. They also keep them away from the public so that the truth can never come out about how they're treated on those reservations. The only way you will know about this is if you actually wanted to look into it through researching, or if you actually visited one yourself. Outside of that, you barely see these people. You barely see them, and you don't think about them because out of sight, out of mind. Truth bonds. I said bonds. Bombs, excuse me. The so-called Native Americans of today are largely Siberian or Mongolian migrants mixed with European blood and installed during the 1800s as part of federal relocation and assimilation programs. They were granted federal recognition and benefits under agreements made with appointed chiefs, many of whom took bribes or were chosen by the government itself, not by tribal custom. Okay, so they say we want to go to assimilate the Cherokee tribe. Okay, we're gonna go to the chief, we'll make a deal with him, and it can go one way or another. If the chief agrees, then we'll make a deal to allow him to stay in his sovereignty while giving up the sovereignty of the people. And if he disagrees, we'll just kill him and do it anyway. So either way, we're gonna get what we want. These reservations are federal land, not sovereign, meaning the government can control their economy, education, healthcare, and what they can say publicly about history. The reservation is not a homeland, it's a gag order on a lie. A lot of their chiefs know the truth. They took deals to continue the lie. They were giving casinos for the lie in exchange for lying about who they are. Why they stay silent or confused? One, they have deals with the United States government. Tribal councils receive money, land, and casino rights in exchange for never challenging the official narrative. Any attempt to acknowledge that the original Negroes were the true indigenous Americans will collapse that tribal sovereignty program overnight. The second reason is integrational misinformation. These Siberian descended groups have now been taught for about 4 to 5 generations that they are the original people. So at this point, they believe it. To them, that's who they are. So most don't know that they were used to replace the original Washita, Yamasee, Muskogee, and Chautauqua peoples and others, many others. But 4 or 5 generations deep, they think that they are the real people. They have been also indoctrinated. And lastly, and third, dependence on federal aid. Reservations are often deeply impoverished with high rates of addiction, suicide, and unemployment. Speaking out risk losing their already limited benefits. Excuse me. So a lot of them are afraid, even if they do know the truth. The role of the fake chiefs. These leaders are often appointed by the United States government or Bureau of Indian Affairs, known as the BIA, complicit in selling out land and rights for personal gain, and silent about the fact that the true indigenous people are now labeled black. They wear the feathers and beads, but hold no ancestral ties to mound building, copper crafting, pyramid laying cultures that predate the Mongolian migration by thousands of years. What they don't want you to know. The Indian Removal Act wasn't just to move tribes west, it was to make room for Siberian imposters to be planted on lands where the original copper colored tribes once lived. Real tribal nations were absorbed, renamed, or erased. We went from Yamasee to Gullah to colored to black, Washita to Negro to non-citizen, to Muskogee to freedman to unclassified. The reason so many black people have Indian in their family but no tribal records is because the government burned, hid, or reassigned the role. All right, let's get into the Salem witch trials. These happened around the same time as Bacon's Rebellion. So from 1692 to 1693. And this is what was really fueling the almost takeout of the elite. Like the Salem witch trials started because of what was happening to kill the elite. So it happened in Salem, Massachusetts, which is colonial New England. Victims, over 200 people accused, 19 were hanged. I'm pretty sure it's way more that's not documented, but this is this is what's been documented. And several others died in prison. The majority were women, both indigenous, black, and poor white. And and white, excuse me, from poor backgrounds. The real reason behind the trials. The Puritans and Pilgrims didn't come to America for religious freedom. They came as colonial crusaders sent to spiritually and culturally conquer the New World. The witches they accused weren't riding broomsticks. They were herbalists, midwives, diviners and seers, root workers and conjurers, indigenous shamans, and women with womb wisdom. These were land-based ancestral spiritualists, and they refused to bow to the Christian God or abandon their generational knowledge that made them enemies of the new empire. So a lot of them were still connected to their roots, and they just wasn't having this lie about Jesus. Why the church and state targeted them? Their medicine worked better than the colonial doctors. Black indigenous midwives were saving mothers and babies while the Christian healers were killing them with mercury and bloodletting. Their rituals brought real results. Protection spells, hexes, divination, and ancestor reverence were restoring power to the oppressed. They could feel when a corrupt judge was coming, see when a merchant was lying, and heal trauma through touch and trance. They passed power through the feminine line. Unlike patriarchal Christianity, these women honored womb cycles, moon phases, and spiritual sovereignty. That threatened the male dominated church structure and the idea that power must come from clergy or crown. They refused to convert. Poor white women, especially those of Irish, Scottish, or Welsh origin, still practiced the old European folk magic deeply tied to Druidism, Norse, and goddess traditions. Black and indigenous women kept their hoodoo root work, Yoruba, and mound temple ways alive in secret. So, what did the system do? They demonized all of it. So, this is how they were able to take us away from what we did naturally. They turned it into demons, demonic, evil, witchcraft, all of that kind of stuff. Um, this is why women in general did not get the right to vote, and white women couldn't even vote for a very long time. because they took the power away from women because women power was actually working. And with those poor white women working with the indigenous so-called black women, those poor so-called white women working with the indigenous so-called black women, the black woman's power was helping their power to increase. So what they were doing was working. Black magic, white magic, and the blurring line. Black indigenous magic, also so-called black magic, came from so-called West Africa, which was really here, Native American, which is also here, and ancient Kemetic practices, which is also here. It's rooted in elemental alchemy, water, wind, fire, earth, ancestral communication, protection rituals, and land harmonics. And its binding and hexing is used to ward off invaders and pedophiles. Okay, our magic is very strong. And then you had white European folk magic, which originated in Celtic, Norse, Slavic, and Mediterranean traditions. It used runes, herbal medicine, seasonal rituals tied to the solstices, fairy and elemental workings, womb magic through herbal fertility and dream work. Together, these spiritual paths intermingled on the plantations in the forest, creating a hybrid, potent spiritual force and hidden rebellion. And that scared the hell out of the Puritans because their power was working. Meanwhile, their power of their Jesus and Lord was not. The Christian agenda. The witch trials were a false flag operation by Puritan leadership. Their goal was to convert or kill. They used accusations of witchcraft to force mass conversions into Christianity, break up spiritual sisterhoods, sever ties to the land and ancestors, and burn ancient knowledge out of the memory. They feared a rebellion rooted in ancestral power, especially among the enslaved poor whites and indigenous descendants. The witch label was a legal tool to exterminate that power before it could organize. So they wanted to get rid of them as quick as possible. Why the women were poor, often marginalized. Poor white women who didn't marry or serve the church were seen as idle, a threat to social order. Black and indigenous women were seen as property, so knowledge in their hands was rebellion. These women had no legal voice, so they were easy to accuse, kill, and erase. Their power didn't come from the Bible or the state, it came from the stars, the earth, and blood memory. So they were using what they were naturally connected to, what they were really trying to destroy. Matriarchal knowledge that preserved tribal lineage and sovereignty. Bloodline memory. Women passed stories, herbs, rituals, and prophecy. Resistance networks between so-called Black indigenous and poor European peoples. And spiritual technologies like dream divination, candle magic, binding and protection sigils. Who benefited from this? Well, this is the new pope here, guys. The church, by gaining mass religious control. The state, by removing spiritual rebels who could expose and hex them. The colonial elite, who rewrote history and burnt the women who held its keys. This is how they were able to dominate in creating this patriarchal system. The Salem witch trials weren't about superstition. They were a ritual purge of the last priestesses, seers, and sovereigns who could break the spell of colonialization. They weren't witches, they were truth tellers, healers, guardians of the earth, and their memory lives in the bones of every woman who still feels her power. So if you're connected to your ancestors, whether you be so-called white or so-called black, if your ancestors were around during this time and were some of the women who were being put to death, you can tap back into that energy to help with bringing this truth forward. And you guys want me to tell you what I think is going to happen, and I could be wrong, but I think this is what's going to happen. All of the time that we've been so-called thinking we were so-called black and fighting for these so-called reparations, and now we know why we haven't gotten them. I feel like now those who are lovers of truth, no matter the color of their skin and what they classify themselves in this false racial caste system, I feel like they're the ones who are going to fight for us this time. We're not going to have to lift a finger, because as they find out the truth, they're going to see how fucked up it is, and they're going to want to do the right thing. And I feel like that's when everything's going to flip over back to the true owners of everything. And I don't know how long that's going to take, but I know as long as we keep spreading this truth, and there are people who are lovers of truth who don't see color as a thing because it's fake, and they're just going to speak the truth no matter where they come from, because they also seeing that they've been lied to as well.